We welcome you to our Bible study on the book of Job, chapter 26. If you will, turn in your Bibles to Job 26, and let's begin our study. Job 26, 1 through 4, describes Job's assessment of the consolations of his friends. In verse 1, it says, "But Job answered and said." This verse begins the long discourse of Job in Job 26 to 31. Job gives his nice speech here in chapter 26, followed by a final statement in chapters 27 to 31. There's a few key passages which break up the passage, which break up the discourse. In Job 26:1, "But Job answered and said." Job 27:1, "Moreover, Job continued his discourse." Job 29:1, Job further continued his discourse. And finally, Job 31:40, the words of Job are ended. And so this long discourse, Job 26 to 31. Chapter 26 is his nice speech, followed by a final statement in chapters 27 to 31. Until Job 32, Job is the only person named. Job is the only person named by name until a new character, Elihu. With this verse, here in chapter 26:1, we see the end of Job's response for the third round of speeches. Previous speeches of Job each began with these words. Then Job answered and said. Chapter 6, 9, 12, 16, 19, 21, and 23. His nice speech begins, "But Job answered and said," beginning in the New King James with the conjunction but Job answered and said. Job 26:1. This is the beginning of Job's last speech to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Let's begin with chapter 26, verse 2. Job says, "How have you helped him who is without power? How have you saved the arm that has no strength?" Job begins his speech with a series of 6 questions, expecting a negative answer for each question in verses 1 to 4. As the pronouns in the passage are singular, Job addresses one person in particular, most likely Bildad, in response to Bildad's previous speech in Job 25. Overall, as we see in following passages, the response is to his 3 friends. Note a similar mode of questioning done previously by Eliphaz in chapter 22 and Bildad in chapter 25. They asked questions expecting a negative answer as a response. Consider Job's response for each of these questions. First, Job tells Bildad that he has not helped him who is without power. If Job was powerless, he had not helped him. Second, he said, "You have not saved the arm that has no strength." If Job was weak, he had not saved him. The arm stands for the whole person. Some commentators read Job's questions here as sarcastic exclamations. For example, we might see in this passage, "How have you helped him who is without power?" ? And compare that to reading it as an exclamation with an exclamation point at the end. "How have you helped him who is without power?" And so one is asked in a way of a question, the other as a sarcastic exclamation. Either way, the message is the same. Bildad, nor any of the other friends, had helped him. If he truly was weak and without power, they had not helped him. If he truly had no strength, Bildad and the others had not saved him. Verse 3. How have you counseled one who has no wisdom? And how have you declared sound advice to many? And so third, Job says that Bildad had not counseled one who has no wisdom. Again, if Job was without wisdom, he had not enlightened him. Fourth, he says, you have not declared sound advice to many. If Bildad was so wise, then where was the abundance of his sound advice to declare to Job? Think of the few passages of his previous speech in chapter 25. Verse 4. To whom have you uttered words, and whose spirit came from you? Fifth, Job tells Bildad that he has not uttered words to him. As these words did not apply to Job, they must have been spoken to someone else. I know you're not talking to me, we might say. Sixth, Job says that your spirit is not your own. It says in the text, and whose spirit came from you? Perhaps Job was saying that Bildad uttered words that came from someone else. In his previous speech, he had repeated some of what was said earlier by Eliphaz in chapter 25. His words certainly did not come from the Spirit of God. Verses 5 to 14, we see God's power and wisdom, as said by Job. Verse 5, the dead tremble, those under the waters, and those inhabiting them. Job surpasses his friends in his exaltation of the greatness of God here in verses 5 to 14. He poetically describes Sheol, the abode of the dead, as being under the waters. And so he describes those inhabiting those waters, or Sheol. Verse 6. Sheol is naked before him, and destruction has no covering. Job says that while hidden from man, Sheol is naked before God. Naked, exposed, visible. Even the abode of the dead is not hidden from God, who clearly sees and knows. While man, who is mortal, knows death, he does not see the place of death, place of the dead. The parallel in this passage to Sheol is destruction. Here, destruction is given as another name for the place of Sheol. The word translated destruction is from the Hebrew term Abaddon in Job 28:22 and Job 31:12. Job later personifies destruction and death in Job 28:22. Look at Proverbs 15:11. I think this passage helps us to better understand what he means here by Sheol and destruction. Sheol being naked before God, destruction having no covering before God, no concealment. Proverbs 15:11. Hell and destruction are before the Lord. So how much more the hearts of the sons of men? Solomon made the point that hell and destruction are before the Lord. He sees, he knows. And how much more does he know the hearts of the sons of men? He does see, he does hear, he does know. In that passage in Proverbs 15:11, hell is from the Hebrew term Sheol, and destruction is from the Hebrew term Abaddon. John in the New Testament writes of the angel of the bottomless pit in Revelation 9:11, whose name he says in Hebrew as Abaddon, literally destruction, but in the Greek is Apollyon, literally destroyer, Revelation 9:11. So the main point here is simply that God sees. Man knows death, but man does not see the abode of the dead until he visits there himself. But God sees. It's as though Sheol is naked before him, invisible. It's as though the destruction has no covering, no concealment. He sees, he knows. Describing the wisdom, the knowledge of the Lord. Verse 7. He stretches out the north over empty space. He hangs the earth on nothing. Here we see how Job says that God stretched out the heavens and the earth is supported by his power. In this verse, north may represent the northern skies, the northern heavens, or the northern skies. Genesis 1 and 2, this passage reminds me of the first verses of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Here, Job says that God stretches out the north over empty space. How he hangs the earth on nothing. Job later speaks poetically of the pillars of heaven. A pillar is the support structure used to support a building. In Job 26:11, he speaks again poetically of those pillars of heaven. Man, while dwelling on the earth, could not comprehend God and his power and how he suspends the earth on nothing. Verse 8, Job says, he binds up the water in his thick clouds, yet the clouds are not broken under it. Job says that how by God's providence, water is stored in the clouds. Yet despite the great weight of the water, the clouds do not break. The clouds do not burst open under the weight and tear, as it were. Man could see the clouds in the sky and see the precipitation that fell from the clouds, knowing that God had bound up the water in his clouds, but man could not comprehend how the water did not fall earlier, how that the clouds did not burst open and release the water all at once. It was beyond his understanding. But certainly God knew and understands. Verse 9. He covers the face of his throne and spreads his cloud over it. Sometimes in the Bible, like the book of Exodus, you see of the cloud following the Hebrews as they left Egypt. Here we see of his presence. Job says that how God covers or conceals his face, or the face of his throne. How God spreads his cloud over the face of his throne. What does he mean here by God's throne? First, God's throne may refer to heaven, like we see in Job 26:11 and 13. It reminds me of a New Testament passage in the New Testament, how Jesus spoke of heaven and earth. He spoke of heaven as God's throne in Matthew 5:33, and as the earth as his footstool, Matthew 5:34. So God's throne here in this passage may refer to heaven, as we've already mentioned. He covers the face of his throne and spreads his cloud over it. So perhaps he's talking about heaven or the heavens. Second, God's throne may refer to his person. Earlier, Job spoke of how God hides his face, Job 13:24, and how Job was unable to see him and his work, Job 23:9. So he covers the face of his throne, and he may be describing his person being hidden from man. Despite the work that he does, the man cannot see God himself. He sees the work, he sees his creation, he sees what is made by the maker, he sees what is created by the creator, but he does not see the one who made it all in person. Some versions read here for throne, full moon. The text actually reads throne, but based on another passage, we see that some read full moon. For example, God covers the face of the moon by spreading his cloud over it. I don't think that it's necessary to make that comment. Other than what we see here, basically that Job sees the work of God's presence. He don't see God himself, but God remains hidden from him. Even though Job wanted to see God, he sought him out, but he could not find him. He could not see him. Of course, it is true that a cloud can cover over the moon or conceal the stars. Cloudy night. Verse 10. He drew a circular horizon on the face of the waters at the boundary of light and darkness. And so Job says how that God marked out a circular horizon on the surface of the waters. It is at the boundary between light and darkness. I think of someone standing on the beach. They're looking out from the seashore, and they see in the distance the ocean, and they see the sea, the horizon, and as if someone took a compass and made a circular horizon on the face of the waters. You see that boundary of light and darkness. If you've ever seen the sun rise from the beach, from the seashore. Solomon personified wisdom when he spoke of God and his creation in Proverbs 8. For example, verses 27 to 29, Job says of God, when he prepared the heavens, I was there, speaking of wisdom. Again, he's personifying wisdom. He's speaking of wisdom as though wisdom was a person. Wisdom is here with God from the beginning. When he, God, prepared the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep. When he established the clouds above. When he strengthened the fountains of the deep. When he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters would not transgress his command. When he marked out the foundations of the earth. And he goes on with that description. But here in the passage, particularly verses 27 and 29, he speaks of as if God drew a circle on the face of the deep. Again, here, he drew a circular horizon on the face of the waters. He also speaks of establishing the clouds above, verse 28. And in verse 29, he speaks of appointing the limits of the sea. Verse 11. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at his rebuke. Again, Job speaks poetically. How God exercises power over the sea. In verse 11, how that the pillars of heaven are strong, but even the pillars tremble before God. Of course, they're not actually pillars such as man made in order to hold up the sky. These pillars may refer poetically to the mountains that appear to man as if they were holding up the sky. With the rebuke of God, even the pillars of heaven, he says, the mountains beneath the sky, they shake and they are amazed. Of course, we know again that mountains or these pillars are not actually amazed, but he speaks of them as though they were people. Speaking figuratively of these pillars, of these mountains, as if they were people who are amazed. Even they are amazed at the might of God, these great mountains or these pillars of heaven. Again, the point that he's making here is that the creation, as great as the creation is, it was made by the Creator. And it's nothing in comparison to the Creator himself. Even the pillars of heaven, he says, tremble, they shake, they quake. They are astonished at his rebuke. The earthquake, it's as though God, the Creator, is rebuking even the mountains. Verse 12. He stirs up the sea with his power, and by his understanding, he breaks up the storm. And so Job continues saying how God exercises power, not just over the heaven, but the sea. God, by his power, he may stir up the sea, or God, by his understanding, may calm the storm of the sea. I think about Jesus in the New Testament calming the Galilean Sea. Peace, be still. The Hebrew term Rahab in this passage is also translated elsewhere, such as in Job 9 and 13, as proud. If the storm, Rahab, refers to some great sea creature, as suggested by some commentators, then the point is that God is mightier than even the greatest of sea creatures. Here in the passage, he stirs up the sea with his power. So we see his might in the waves of the sea, but also we see his understanding and power as he's able to calm or break up the storm. As proud as those waves may be, as mighty as the sea, he breaks up the storm. Again, not even the sea compares to the Creator and his power. Verse 13. By his spirit he adorned the heavens. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. So God, by his spirit, adorned the heavens. Basically, the point is that God made the host of heaven. He made the sun, the moon, and the stars, just as we see in Genesis 1. In Psalm 33 and 6, the psalmist said, by the word of the Lord, the heavens were made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. So here, Job is saying that by God's Spirit, God, adorned the heavens. Those beautiful stars in the sky. God created the stars, the sun and the moon. The second part of the passage reads, his hand pierced the fleeing serpent. There's differences of opinion concerning what is meant by the fleeing serpent. One such suggestion is that this may refer to a constellation, a grouping of stars in the sky. That would seem to fit with what we see here of him adorning the heavens with the stars. And so in the context of the heavens, the fleeing serpent might refer to a constellation. For example, Job said, speaking of the greatness of his creation, in Job 9 and 8, he alone spreads out the heavens. It's a lengthy passage, but let's read again Job 9, 4 to 13. We've studied this in the past, but let's look at it again. And I think you can see the relation between what we see here and what Job said earlier in Job 9, 4-13. God is wise in heart and mighty in strength. Who has hardened himself against him and prospered? He removes the mountains, and they do not know, when he overturns them in his anger. He shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble. He commands the sun, and it does not rise. He seals off the stars. He alone spreads out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. He made the Bear, Orion, and the Pleiades, and the chambers of the south. He does great things past finding out. Yes, wonders without number. If he goes by me, I do not see him. If he moves past me, I do not perceive him. If he takes away, who can hinder him? Who can say to him, what are you doing? God will not withdraw his anger. The allies of the proud lie prostrate beneath him. Here in this earlier passage in Job 9, 4-13, we see again the wisdom and power of God and his creation. Note a couple of the key parts of the passage, at least parts that I would like to mention today. Job 9 and 6, he shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble. Again, he's speaking poetically. The earth does not actually have pillars. And we've seen in our text today, as said by Job, that he hangs the earth upon nothing. He knows full well that there are not actual pillars holding up the heavens or the earth. But he speaks of God and how he's able to support it, these things by his power. He also speaks of various constellations in verse 9. The Bear, Orion, the Pleiades. So these various constellations. And so perhaps that's what he's meaning here by the fleeing serpent in connection with adorning the heavens with the stars. He also mentions that word proud in Proverbs, or in Job 9 and 13 that we mentioned earlier, Rahab. There's a passage, without commenting on the verse, Isaiah 27:1. In that day, the Lord with his severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, that twisted serpent, and he will slay the reptile that is in the sea. Isaiah 27:1. Fleeing serpent, the same Hebrew terms are translated the same way in both passages. Verse 14, he concludes the first chapter of this long discourse and the end of his response to the friends. Verse 14, indeed, these are the mere edges of his ways, and how small a whisper we hear of him. But the thunder of his power, who can understand? Verses 5-14 is really a great passage describing the wisdom and power of God in his creation. Here in verse 14, Job concludes his exaltation of God. He looks at creation and he lifts up the Creator. In the past, he thought perhaps of God as his enemy. He's suffering all these terrible afflictions. Perhaps God as his enemy. But now he looks at God as the Creator and his great wisdom and his power. And first, he notes that these things that he's mentioned here in verses 5-14 are the mere edges of his ways. You look at the work of God in creation, and he mentions a few of these things. And he says that these are the mere edges of his way, the outskirts, the edges, the fringes. He has not exhausted his discussion of God's greatness in the least. The things that he mentions are but the fringes. They're but the edges, as if of a garment. Second, these things that he has uttered are but a whisper of the greatness that we hear, of the thunderous power of God. Man, he says, cannot understand the mighty thunder of God's power. Let's read that passage one more time. Indeed, he says, indeed, these are the mere edges of his ways, and how small a whisper we hear of him. But the thunder of his power, who can understand? One, there were things that Job could not even see, let alone comprehend. These are the fringes, so to speak. These are things as if a whisper. But this is what we hear of God in the creation. We see of his greatness. That's the end of our study today, and I hope this has been helpful in better understanding this chapter of the book of Job. Thanks for being here, and Lord willing, we'll see you again in the future. Thanks for being here today.